What do you consider we should put in this film?
You should put an empty field at the beginning and then hopefully an empty field at the end.
Very groovy, man. This is our generation, man. All you people, we're all together, man. It's groovy.
I can see we're going to have one hell of a great festival. I really do feel that.
It's a free concert from now on. That doesn't mean that anything goes. What that means is we're going to put the music up here for free.
This is the largest group of people ever assembled in one place. The important thing that you're proving to the world is that 500,000 young people can get together and have 3 days of fun and music and have nothing but fun and music.
I had a jazz club in Boston, and some people from Newport came into my club, and they said we'd like to do something to liven up the summer in Newport. Next thing I know, I thought about, what about jazz festival? There were no jazz festivals at that time. There were very little outdoor entertainment in a festival concept. And so we started with that in mind. Next thing I know, I had a line of credit at the bank for $20,000, which I couldn't believe because $20,000 was a fortune of money. But I didn't know anything about doing festivals. We were looking for people that had speakers that could project sound out. There was no sound companies available and lighting. No, we were writing the book as we went along.
It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing.
But we broke even the first year. I bought Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Lenny Tristano, Dizzy Gillespie. I had so many different people. And I called Newport Jazz the first annual, because somehow or other I felt it would continue if we did it once. And I figured Newport was an ideal place. I had to take a ferry from Jamestown or pay a toll from Bristol. Couldn't get here. So I figured it's a great place for a festival.
It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. Boo-wah, 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 boo-wah.
And then after the jazz festival, I had at my club, Pete Seeger would come and Josh White would come and a lot of the folk singers would come. I said, there's enough here to do a folk festival. And that was 1959. And that took off immediately because what Pete did, and he understood something, all the artists were asked to come for $50 a night, whether they were a $100,000 group like Peter, Paul and Mary or Bob Dylan or Joan Baez, or whether they were a Canadian folk singer who had never played in America. And then that's how we created the feeling of that festival. But the fact that we were doing what we were doing became a political thing. We got Lyndon Johnson to mention "We Shall Overcome" on a speech. We were different. We were not just entertainment. We had a message. It was the total concept of integration of performers and integrated audiences, because we brought a mixed crowd. This was a Navy town, and there were a lot of Southern people here. And it took a few years to educate the town, but we did. And a few years later, Newport elected an African-American as mayor, so that was quite a change. We had a lot to do with that, I think. We've had an influence politically, geographically, and sociologically, and it's affected the presentation of music.
Well, the Newport Jazz Festival and then eventually the Newport Folk Festival, we're talking about the late 50s, early 60s, and big outdoor festivals of this kind were unknown at that point, more or less. But they were tremendous successes, and I think one of the reasons for that was the sense of community that these festivals generated at the time. It was the first time that, like-minded people had come together in an outdoor setting in big numbers to appreciate music together. And then, of course, that echoed across to us in Britain.
So festivals were well known in the jazz community, but certainly no pop festivals. But what was extraordinary about it was this is the National Jazz Federation, they were called, who ran the Marquee Club, which was the breaking ground for The Who and a few other bands as well. So eventually the National Jazz Festival kind of became the first rock festival because some of the artists that were taking over at the Marquee Club were R&B bands like The Who, Stones, Eric Clapton, John Mayall, that kind of band.
As the jazz festival developed, so it began to encompass these blues-infused groups. And by the mid-60s, the whole idea of festivals was now beginning to take hold. But I think the impetus more, just at this particular moment, was coming from America. Monterey, to my mind, was the turning point of the whole concept of big outdoor festivals.
Monterey was incredibly significant. It was the first proper pop festival, really. It was billed as a pop festival. It was created by musicians. It was driven by the Mamas and the Papas. It was a festival of love and peace and the California ethic of the day. There was LSD, there were beautiful people and a peaceful ambience generally.
Monterey was sensational. It was a gathering of like-minded people, open-minded people, people with a common interest in this burgeoning new social scene that was happening in the mid-60s. The music was the expression of that.
But the audience was quite small. It was only about 30,000. It was the film that followed then that made one feel that you were reaching a wider audience.
A guy called me up. He asked me if I would be interested in filming a music festival in California. And I thought, at this time, at this moment in America, everybody's graduating from high school. The only thing they want to do is get to California. So I thought, that's a great place to have a pop music festival. I mean, everybody thought this was such a great thing to do, so they were all excited to be involved in it.
Monterey is very groovy, man. This is something, man. This is our generation, man. All you people, we're all together, man. It's groovy.
Anybody that played there was glad to be there once they were there. It was a little bit painful for The Who because we arrived at the same time as Jimi Hendrix, who was doing roughly the same kind of stage antics, but perhaps with a little bit more class.
Whoa,
You know, Jimi Hendrix and The Who were a little bit of a kind of a clash with that peaceful ambience because our acts were both kind of violent. But that was a significant, that was the first big festival and I think, you know, seminal really for The Who and for Jimi.
There was Monterey showing that you could stage and organise a festival of this size where you did have white rock and roll bands, but also you had Ravi Shankar, Otis Redding. I mean, a lot of the people that went to Monterey had never seen probably a black artist on stage because the crowd was predominantly white. So it really was groundbreaking in terms of the eclecticism of the bands.
Monterey was significant in the way that not just music was presented or performed or that people gathered, but rather in the context of somebody buying a ticket and going to a show and thinking, something is happening here and we don't know what it is.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear.
I think we caught a fantastic moment in musical history. It caught that wave just at the right time. And it was like a revolution. There was nothing, before that, there was nothing like that involving popular music. What they were saying was, get your ass together because it's serious. And music had never been serious before. And of course it bit, you know, that, and it changed everything. It changed not just the music, but it changed our lives.
There's battle lines being drawn, but nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
The counterculture of the 60s is the essential backdrop, and the music represented an alternative attitude and with songs that had something to say. Now, you've got the Vietnam War going on, which spread to this country, the protests about it spread to this country, and we had riots in Grosvenor Square and that sort of thing happening. We have a new phenomenon of the underground press, and you're also in a decade when there's massive social change. A lot of things were happening all within the space of a few years. The combined effect of all this is that young people who are thinking, well, this is a new world, a brave new world, you know, we don't have to go along with all this stuff that our parents' generation had to.
In terms of the counterculture in the late 60s, the whole environment encouraged freedom of expression, whatever way that may be. And there was a synthesis of like minds at that moment that were forming this huge community that for a few years bound everybody together, certainly across the Atlantic.
Can you make it to the island, rock and roll island, in the middle of the high sea?
Well, it started off with my brother being asked to come and join in with some fundraising to build a swimming pool for the Isle of Wight. And we spent a lot of brainstorming, working out what we could do to raise funds, whether we have a lottery or some village dances, that sort of thing. And out of all this emerged the idea of a festival. We didn't know how much was involved. We just thought, well, we've got to find a farmer that will rent us some land, a couple of fields, and we'll book the groups. We'll have to hire equipment, we'll have to build a stage and a few basic things. It was all terribly amateurish, and Ronnie, my brother, just made it his business to find out what you had to do to book attractions, and he found an agency, a small-time agency that was pretty useful in a way, because they could then go and talk to other agents, and they just put the whole package together for us. And they happened to know about Jefferson Airplane coming over that summer and wanting another UK date, which tied in with our date. So that was really a piece of luck. And they also delivered Arthur Brown with his Crazy World of Arthur Brown, and had a chart single at the time, which got to #1, I think, just around about the same time as the festival. So we had two very, very big names, and then a whole string of names that we'd barely heard of, which did actually include the Pretty Things and, yeah, a few names that have since been more heard of. It's like Tyrannosaurus Rex. The only trouble was it was at God's Hill. God's Hill is like really about as far as you could go on the Isle of Wight in terms of difficulty of getting there. Dreadful, dreadful route to get from Ryde or any of the ferry ports to God's Hill. And the difficulties with the local people, they were going berserk. I mean, this thing caught them unawares, and there wasn't any trouble as such, but there was a lot of inconvenience. And the locals had done things like cut our telephone wires, and they used the old wartime trick of turning all the signposts around, like you see in Dad's Army, which was, I mean, it sounds amusing now, but it was pretty horrendous at the time. And if you ever try and get to that site following signposts, and you'd realise what that meant, because it's like a maze of country roads. The facilities in '68 was pretty lamentable. The gents' urinals were just a stretch of black plastic on a framework and running down half the length of the field. And I think for the women, there were just a few cubicles that we'd hired in.
The loos were basically a trench with a scaffolding bar that people sat on. And I saw this bloke sitting on the scaffolding bar and fall backwards, slowly but surely, into the trench. It was the most disgusting thing I've ever seen.
The Melody Maker described it a week or so later when they did a piece about this new thing called a festival that was becoming quite vogue, that the Isle of Wight was a great example of how not to put on a festival. These sort of amateurs coming along, don't know what they're doing, they've not got the resources or the experience or anything.
They were the most primitive events in the world. You know, there'd be one stage, there would be no diamond vision screens, there would be no sound delay towers, unless you were literally within 50 yards of that stage. It's highly unlikely you would know even who's on, you know. And the suffering, of which there was plenty, unbelievably terrible toilets, shocking absence of food, just the most appalling conditions, like something out of the First World War. You know, those were endurable, I think, because you were a gang of people who felt a sense of community by being together. And you were pathetically grateful for whatever entertainment was dished up to you.
We had about 30,000 people there, which was quite something, actually. The weather was over 80 degrees, sunny all day. Dope had been discovered, and people were very mellow. We were very amateur, to say the least. We turned up the day before the festival, supervised a little of the placing of things, decided that the public could watch from one boundary, so we had some tarpaulins wrapped along the fence by the river, and then went to the hotel across the road where we often stayed and went to bed and forgot about it until about 6 in the morning. I was woken by the sound of footsteps, marching people outside our hotel room. And I thought, oh, blimey, we're running a festival. Our stages were fairly basic, as it was early days, and we hadn't got into the extravagances of these huge stages we had later. And nice were fine, they were playing beautifully and everything was going smoothly. And then suddenly they introduced 4 bagpipers and 4 very, very large Scotsmen stomped onto the stage, which promptly started to collapse. So I thought, oh my God, here we go. So I got 4 of my burliest stewards under the stage holding it up. We had 10 Years After and Taste and Nice and all sorts of people, and Led Zeppelin were 4th on the bill. And one thing I remember about Led Zeppelin's appearance is we were in the backstage area, and there was suddenly this amazing, absolute riotous sound, and we looked at each other and said, oh my God, rushed out. We thought there was a riot, and it turned out to be the reception Led Zeppelin were getting, so gave us an idea of what to expect in the future from them. It was, I think, the best profit of any festival, the easiest profit we'd ever made. After that, it was all downhill.
There were some festivals in England in '68 and then in '69. And there were several festivals in America at that time, a lot of which had a lot of problems. But then came Woodstock, and that kind of blew the top off of everything. It was a cultural festival. It was a festival for the counterculture. It was all of the arts and all of the politics and all of the hopes and dreams of our counterculture. And it came at a time when things had deteriorated. You know, the flower power movement and peace and love was going out the window pretty fast. There were lots of violent uprisings around the country. There was the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and Malcolm X, and things were looking pretty grim for the peace and love crowd. So we thought, let's take all of that away. Let's bring it out into nature. Let's bring ourselves out into nature and see if we could actually, you know, embody the dream that we had and see if it could work. So it became this gathering of the tribes and a time to reflect and to sort of rededicate ourselves to those goals. And that's what we got on steroids. We faced thousands of problems getting this going, actually. I mean, you know, for us, there was no model for this. There had never been an event of this size. And so we really had to invent it as we went along. But, you know, we were basically building a city for 200,000 people, which was our target, to survive for 3 days. Kids who had never been to the country for the most part, nonetheless spending time out in the woods. There'd never been a sound system to deal with a crowd of that size. There'd never been an outdoor sanitation system or water system or any of that. So that was really part of the big challenge, was creating this city for people to survive in for 3 days. We put out a number, 50,000. Wasn't the most honest thing to do, but it was survival for us. So that's kind of what the number was that we circulated.
I was expecting a very well-organised festival, which I think it was, but it fell apart simply because they didn't expect the kind of numbers to come who came. I think there were about 450,000 on the green and maybe about another 300,000 who had come, who eventually turned around and went home. So there's this sense that this was the culmination of the Vietnam generation's resistance. And of course, all the Americans were there, were kind of going, this is it, we've changed the world, you know. They were all off their heads.
This is the largest group of people ever assembled in one place. The important thing that you're proving to the world is that 500,000 young people can get together and have 3 days of fun and music. And have nothing but fun and music.
It was the people that made it happen. You know, the audience were the stars for the bands and for everybody. It wasn't about who was, you know, the headline act or who was the biggest act. It was about the fact that this music was all part of our counterculture. And so when we made the deals with the artists, we had certain regulations, one of which was that everybody would get the same size billing, 100% billing for everybody, that the acts would be listed alphabetically, that the show would be programmed according to sort of the energy of the day rather than who was the biggest act and who was going to close the show. And everybody went along with it. But there were many, many highlights. Hendrix and Joe Cocker and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Santana, acts that nobody had heard before, you know, made just tremendous impressions on everybody. But I think the act that connected most with the audience musically was Sly and the Family Stone. They had just this incredible call and response with the audience. It was like a psychedelic church. It was amazing.
Everybody was handling it very differently. You know, Sly and the Family Stone handled it by taking loads of cocaine and then doing a set which was mind-blowingly brilliant. I mean, they were sharp. They were probably the best thing at the gig. But for example, my friend John Sebastian went on in front of the audience on his own, played a few songs, played the mouth organ, told a few jokes. He treated it like a kind of an evening with John Sebastian. There were quite a few folk artists there who managed to work that crowd. And of course, I thought it was a shitstorm. I hated it. I despised everybody that I could see for various reasons and didn't want to be there. Also, we were backstage trying to work out how to get onto the stage, which was covered in mud, so you would slither about everywhere. And if you turned on the radio, you would hear these stories. 2 million people have shown up in Woodstock. Woodstock town, the mayor has decided to create an emergency zone. The National Guard are flying in supplies. 2 babies have been born, 1 has died. 69 victims of bad LSD have been taken to hospital. 3 of them, have brain seizures. This is on the radio when we're about to go on the stage.
It's a song about you and me. We're getting a bit old now. A song called My Generation.
People try to put us down, just because we they do look awful. Hope I die before I get old.
I went to every event in the States that year, and pretty much every place that I went, there were confrontations with the police, and people wanted to crash the gates. There was this big movement kind of going around, which was that music should be free, and it belonged to the counterculture, and it was being ripped off. And we really wanted Woodstock to be something that welcomed everybody who wanted to be a part of it. We didn't want anybody turned away for any reason if they didn't have money. There were free stages, free campgrounds, free kitchens, free food. So it was conceived from the beginning as something that was welcoming for everybody. We didn't have police in uniforms. We had a peace patrol. We removed every kind of premeditated confrontation that we could. We hired the hog farm to come in. They were a commune from New Mexico who were used to dealing with outdoor events and could teach people how to set up campgrounds and welcome them and make them feel like they were part of a community. And it was we tried to stay true to the principles of the counterculture, and we made the fee to come for those people who were going to buy tickets as cheap as we could. I think it was $18 for 3 days and $6 a day, $7 at the gate. There was no gate. We never got the ticket booths put into place, so the festival was, when it was announced that it was free, it was kind of a foregone conclusion for us. We kind of knew there was no way to collect tickets. But it was based on not confronting those kinds of problems, of allowing people to feel part of it, whether they wanted to pay for it or not.
It's a free concert from now on. That doesn't mean that anything goes. What that means is we're going to put the music up here for free.
Woodstock was hard going. It felt so out of control and so big. It was a very, very muddy, difficult to get in and out. There was no clean water. The sewage came apart. It was a tough festival. It was, it would make Glastonbury look like a bit of an easy weekend. But behind it, backstage, there was this sense of, from this mud, from this chaos, something will rise.
I think why it's had such a lasting impression on the world, in essence, and it has, is I think it provided a moment of hope that the world could be a better place and that we could get along with, empathy and love. And, as I say, it was at a terrible time in our history, and not just in the States, but around the world. And I think, I've heard from people in other countries from all over, even behind the Iron Curtain, that Woodstock really symbolized, that potential for things to really kind of become better. We didn't want to repeat Woodstock. It was, for me, it was a once kind of in a lifetime thing. At the time, it wasn't a career move or an industry. And festivals didn't really take hold in America for a long time. There were some events here and there, but nothing consistent. Whereas in Europe, there were festivals in Germany and festivals in Scandinavia and festivals in England, and they really started to take root and become kind of permanent fixtures and part of the summer landscape.
One of the things we'd learned was you need to have a big name to make it work. Otherwise, you're never going to get people to come across the water. And so Ronnie, my brother, went to some bookshop in Charing Cross Road because he'd heard there was an article about Bob Dylan that had mentioned something about his manager. And he went all the way from the Isle of Wight to London to go and find this magazine and find out who his manager was. And we started phoning up his agency in New York. And we went from there. And I took over the negotiations. And so we'd talk about things, chat about possibilities. And we put together a package which we thought might be attractive in the way of a holiday for his family, come over on the QE2, see the island, have a car with a chauffeur and spend some time to visit things like the home of Tennyson and, throwing in all these names that the island was noted for. And so in the end, it chimed in with his agenda, which was to have a go at getting back into performing. And we struck lucky.
It's difficult to describe how kind of mysterious and mythical Dylan had become by that time. Remember, he'd kind of gone to ground for about 3 years. So his appearance at the Isle of Wight was a very, very significant moment. It was huge for us, too, to be on that bill. It felt like, as kids, we'd done shows on the same bill as the Beatles, and that was fun, and the same shows as the Kinks and the Stones. But this particular event was very, very significant.
She's got everything she needs. She's an artist. She don't look bad. She's got everything she needs. She's an artist. She don't look bad. She'll take the dark out of the nighttime and turn the daytime black.
Dylan was living in Woodstock. He knew Michael Lang, who was putting on Woodstock. All summer he was touring with the IOW, doing Woodstock. He turned his back on them and he left on the day that the Woodstock Festival started. That lives in the memory in a big way. But there was another big moment, and that was arriving at the festival on the Friday night. The thing was in full swing, and I'd been in the office all day, and I arrived backstage, and the show producer takes me up the ramp, and I hadn't seen anything of the audience prior to this, and then this vista, as far as the eye could see, was just people. And my heart skipped a beat. I thought, crikey, we've really done it this time. This is it. We've really got this thing going.
There were a lot of big acts that were on the show, but it was very well organised, right-sized, and we were really comfortable by that time doing it. I remember going on and doing that show and feeling, flew in on a helicopter, did the show, easy peasy kind of stuff. In fact, our roadies cleared up the field afterwards. When all the fans went home, they left their shit everywhere. And it's where I got the line Teenage Wasteland.
Teenage wasteland. It's only teenage wasteland. Teenage wasteland. Oh yeah. Teenage wasteland. They're all wasted.
There is no doubt in my mind, and a number of other responsible people, that this isn't only just hippie fun. Behind it is black power, and behind that is communism. You see, the whole thing is, if you have a festival with all the stops pulled out, kids running about naked, doing every damn thing that they feel inclined to do, I don't know that's particularly good for this country.
You could see that society looked upon all this with absolute horror. Revolution, and the kids are getting out of control. Look at all the drugs they're taking. But the festival environment was a kind of no holds barred. You could kind of do whatever the hell you wanted. Your parents weren't there to, make sure that you weren't misbehaving. The whole environment encouraged freedom of expression, whatever way that may be. Everyone, I think, was pushing out the boundaries to see how far they could go.
The 1970 Bath Festival of Blues and Progressive Music, to give it its very full and pretentious title, had bands that I really enjoyed. The Byrds, Zeppelin, Jefferson Airplane, Frank Zappa and the Muffins. The music was really good. people started arriving virtually a week before the event. And instead of 30,000, we had, I guess, something like 150,000. And the event just escalated beyond what we could have believed.
It was quite hysterical, really, because it was traffic management chaos. Things were in the very early days of, there was no experience on which to draw for actually handling large numbers of people and getting them into a site and off again, apart from that which had been gathered from county shows and farmers' meetings and things like that. But actually a rock and roll crowd has different requirements.
We drove there, and at about 10:30 in the morning, we came to a standstill because the traffic was just a complete traffic jam, and both directions. We couldn't go anywhere, so I flagged down a guy on a motorbike, one of the local Hells Angels, who gave me a lift. Eventually, we all got to the festival site, and I persuaded the Hells Angels to go backwards and forwards, ferrying musicians to the festival.
I played at festivals where bikers were the security guards. I don't think in any cases would any promoter have chosen to have bikers as security guards. It was a bit like a protection racket. It was, if you don't want trouble, let us in for free, give us beer, and we'll be your security guards.
The Hells Angels would run the festival. That's not a great thing, I'll be honest. I can tell you, from bitter experience, that having the Hells Angels in charge is not brilliant.
The whole schedule was chaos, that everyone went on as and when they could. What we wanted to try and do was get on earlier, because everything was clearly running later and later and so on. And there was a conversation, I think, with, is it Johnny Winter? Which was very entertaining, because he wanted to help, but as he explained, he'd just done all the drugs to bring him up to full performance mode, and consequently wouldn't work at all well for him to hang on for another couple of hours. So we ended up having to go on late.
I loved the music, I loved the people, but it was just very, very difficult for us, and I hated it. The actual pressure on me to make it work was just absolutely horrendous.
We hopped over there, me and my girlfriend, and we kind of fall in love and all that kind of thing, so that we're in the right frame of mind to appreciate the whole hippie flower power thing. And I thought, my God, this is fantastic, all these millions of hippies and all the blokes and girls looking fantastically attractive. And so I just fell for it.
I think this is the quickest way of clearing my head of a job. I'm just an average sort of fella. I'm not all that conning type, I do enjoy it, but obviously I've got an overdraft and I've got to try and clear it,
The farm overdraft was only 5,000 those days, and of course it's 1.3 million now, so that didn't work, did it? So... About 1,000 people at the most. And it was only £1 to come in, and they got free milk and things as well. And so it was a good deal.
It's just like a handful of people in a field, hippies, mostly, I think. They were sitting there, we were all hanging out. I'd done a gig the night before in Bristol, and that's probably pretty much why I was there. But there's a picture of me standing on stage at the first one. That's how I know I was there.
It was a lovely sunny afternoon, sunny evening. And it was a very romantic setting. And it did work for me, even though I'd lost 1,500 quid, which was a fortune for me in those days. But I got bitten by the bug, and I just couldn't leave it alone after that.
It was the Woodstock of Europe in 1970. I mean, there were 600,000 people. The population of the Isle of Wight now is only 150,000, so it was probably below 100,000 then. And it just became iconic because it had the Doors, Jimi Hendrix's last big performance, The Who doing Tommy. It was a bonding of a generation, and because of that, they banned it for 32 years by an Act of Parliament.
It was the size of it
and the range of it. You had Joni Mitchell, very quiet with alto harp and piano. Then you had Jethro Tull 10 years after. You had avant-garde jazz. I mean, I was completely blown away by Miles Davis. And it went on day and night for 5 days. I mean, this is lovely today, but you imagine this with 500,000 people. You know, it was just extraordinary.
It became huge. It was supposed to be 400,000, and I think it ended up as 675,000, some estimates even higher.
The numbers that are there are often exaggerated. I'm not going to quote a figure on how many were there, but it was pretty big, though.
I was aware that it was bigger than anything before it. In other words, it was even bigger than Woodstock. It was considered the last great event, and it wasn't anything like it was not going to happen after that.
I can see we're going to have one hell of a great festival. I really do feel that.
It was quite a big enterprise by the time we got to the 70 Festival. We went rather overboard in terms of what we were doing. We set up offices, which we hadn't had the previous year. We had 40 or 50 people working there. The whole thing was just getting bigger and bigger. So the budget was sort of running out of control as well. Also, we were having to pay artist balances as the event was progressing, having 50% paid in cash on the day. And they wanted literally cash, they didn't want a check or anything. So we were counting out the money from the box office, basically. And we were really relying on hundreds of thousands of people to break even.
You will not be allowed in without a ticket, so please have a ticket.
The arena was set at the foot of a hill, and the hill was owned by the National Trust. And we were in contract with the National Trust to fence that off, because they didn't want people on their land. And we didn't want them on there either, as it happened, because it would be overlooked and people would need to buy a ticket. So we had every reason to fence it off, and every time we tried to fence it off, as quickly as we put out fencing, they took it down.
No fence, no fence, fence, no festival. Got that?
These agitators or anarchists, whatever you want to call them, they were sort of some quite hard-line people who were saying it should be a free festival.
This festival business is becoming a psychedelic concentration camp. Power to the people!
It's not that it was necessarily very badly organised, but it had got so much bigger than I think they anticipated it would be, just in terms of the numbers of people attending. The security fences were not impregnable. And during the course of the festival, by the time we got to the third day, it was getting pretty nasty outside. A lot of people had arrived who couldn't get in, didn't have tickets, and there was no way to fit them in. And they were getting pretty angry, to the point where the fences were broken down and it ended up in chaos.
There was this influx of political activists, and they burst the barriers at the back, but then a lot of people that had arrived on the Isle of Wight who didn't have tickets came in, so it really went to pieces.
We put this festival on, you bastards! We worked for 1 year for you pigs! And you want to break our walls down? Well, you go to hell!
Far from being a laid-back kind of hippie love and peace thing, it was resembling an episode from The Walking Dead. I mean, it was getting very ugly out there. And so we were well aware of what was happening at that point, that it was getting pretty scary. We also knew we weren't going to get paid because there was no money. And I don't know about the other acts.
Did you get paid in the end?
Nope. Didn't matter, though.
I'd come almost with the intention of doing the show, and if we got paid, we got paid. If we didn't, we didn't, and we didn't. But, you know, it was a fairly prestigious thing to be doing because we were still relatively early on in our, we'd only, been together for a couple of years. And Jimi Hendrix, Jethro Tull, I think the Moody Blues, I think we were the sort of closing act on the final day. And Jimmy, he wanted to go on before Jethro Tull. He was unhappy that we beat him to it to get our gear set up, so his crew were trying to set up their equipment while my guys were setting up our stuff, and we got plugged in first and started. And Hendrix had to go back to his dressing room and wait, and he had to close the show, by which time it was getting fairly unpleasant. A lot of bad stuff happening in the periphery of the audience, and it was the last time I saw him was as I walked away with the thought, have a good one, Jimmy. And very sadly, of course, a few weeks after that, he lost his life.
thing about Hendrix is he was a bit of a shaman. He had an aura around him. He used to manage to sort of summon up something. He was quite extraordinary, very graceful performer. So he had this kind of thing where he kind of, you know, you couldn't take your eyes off him.
Came on very late, I mean 2 or 3 a.m, and he was blazing. And the last hour, that was really most of the iconic performance, was just beautiful, beautiful performance. And again, the fact it was in the middle of the night made it very special, very strange. It was like a dream, a waking dream.
Who shucks? Foxy lady.
I think in a way the Isle of Wight does have a fitting place in a kind of societal marking of the end of an era, because it was the end of the whole hippie drippy ideal. You know, the love and peace thing came to a pretty sordid end. But also, perhaps more importantly, it became an object lesson in, you want to do festivals, you've got to get it right. You can't take on more than you can chew and be hoping that somehow love and peace is going to get you through. So the organisers of that particular festival learned a sorry lesson, which I hope, you know, may have saved somebody else's bacon later on in realising how wrong these things can go when they get out of hand.
In the case of Woodstock, they'd managed to celebrate that festival as a great peace and love happening, despite all their terrible, terrible difficulties, like which we never had. They had bad weather, they had bad acid, they had 500 people hospitalised, they had 3 people killed. You know, we had nothing like that. Yet that festival was set in aspect as the greatest peace and love happening in the history of the world, and our festival is a troublesome blip at the end of the 60s, when the 60s died, which is a travesty, really, because our festival was every bit as more peaceful probably than Woodstock. People loved it, and the friction that took place, and that was considerable, was something that the audience was not aware of most of the time. In the context of 5 days of what happened, these were really minuscule sort of occurrences. Another thing that had happened prior to the 1970 Isle of Wight, sort of 8 months earlier, was Altamont, at the Stones concert. And of course at Altamont there was a stabbing, several other deaths, terrible, terrible trouble going on. That was in December '69. That, I think, if anything, and that was bang on the end of the 60s. That was more of a turning point than ours. I think that we were something in the wake of that, in that we were feeling the effects of that bad feeling that had. And there was a feeling that these very, very large festivals were precarious and, if not dangerous, and could lead to bad things. And it just felt that it was just not doable anymore on that kind of scale.
The whole thing made me think that this was a fantastic festival, wonderful lineup, wonderful music, but the structure is completely wrong, because it had a double fence all the way around the arena and security men. I said, this is awful. This is scurrilous. I rebelled. I thought, well, I went out of sight and I went up the hill. And there were a lot of people who didn't pay to go in anyway up there, and the sound was absolutely brilliant. And you could see the whole site. You see the crowd, stage, you hear the music. It was perfect. And in the car going back up to London, it was full of people, pretty stoned people, and a lot of half-eaten chickens in the boot. I said, we've got to have a proper festival, one that doesn't have all that commercialism. It's got to be a giving event. And if you want to contribute, you can contribute.
One of his mates came to my first festival in '70, and so they phoned him and said, you got to get on the phone to Michael Eavis, because he got a site down there and he's just run out of a show, and which is ideal for the '71 Free Festival, you see.
I said to him, look, I want to do this festival. It's going to be free. All the bands are going to play for nothing. I thought, well, this is okay, because he said yes all the time, and I couldn't understand why. I got this lunatic idea, which it was pretty loopy, wasn't it?
They were slightly off their heads in a way. It was very sort of anti-capitalistic and all that sort of thing, you know, was the mood of the times. I mean, it's very hippie-orientated.
It was a remarkable experience because everybody got fired up by it. They thought it was a good idea. And people came from all sorts of places. Where did they come from? I don't know. They just arrived.
It tends to be a bit muddy. Have you got any boots with you? You do? Nice. OK. Come on, sleep well. Bye.
I took the rooms at the top of the farmhouse and I had the telephone up there. And so that's where the hub was. And Bill Harkin had the kitchen on the next floor down for his drawing board.
I could see two beams of light rising. This was the first pyramid image of all the audience, in turn, dematerialized in front of me, and I woke up.
I had a dream, did a little sketch of it in the night and a couple of words. Thought no more about it, woke up in the morning, and there was my night's notations, and it showed a stage, and there were two beams of light forming what I read as being like a pyramid form, two searchlights, you could say. Well, I've worked on stages many times before, having designed for drama and ballet. And that evening I made a model of this pyramid shape. And Julie took that with me down to Worthy Farm.
We were sitting around in the house up there and thinking about what form the stage should take. And Bill jumped up and said pyramid. I said, yes, immediately.
The early arrivals, the audience came out of the woodwork or out of the grass as needed, and the clock was ticking. But all that was raised up, yeah. And some of the bands actually helped me build the stage. It was a great effort.
We had no publicity whatsoever because we couldn't afford it. I think I probably would have done something about that, but we didn't have the money. It was bad enough to get the basic facilities here.
It was virtually funded by the Churchill family, really, because Arabella was left some money when she was 21. She's a Churchill girl, and Andrew introduced her to me. So the whole thing worked exceedingly well. And so she paid for it. Andrew had all the eco ideas and stuff. And he was quite charismatic. You know, he looked very good at the time. And I think they actually started the whole of the green movement. It really started here in 1971.
It would be very nice to see not just Glastonbury Fair happen, but lots of small festivals happening with the same motive, at the same time, perhaps 4 times a year, at both solstices, at both equinoxes. You see, we can't tell what good will come out of it until we try.
The police told me there were 15,000 people there. And I got up on the stage and I said, look, this is too big. You've got to have, let's have small ones all over the country.
It was a great idea. The whole idea was fantastic. And a very fashionable event. Everybody wanted to come because it was free. And it had some reasonable bands come and play as well. So the whole thing worked exceedingly well.
I do remember getting there in the afternoon and driving my car right up to the stage across fields. Of course, there was no fences or because it was free. People just drove in, camped where they could, and enjoyed the music. And of course, in those days, everybody was on the side of the stage as well, and it was just a wonderful atmosphere. And there was a sense that we were entering a brave new world. Not sure whether we were or not, but there was a sense of it.
We're still in a moment where there was this resistance to the idea of commercializing these festivals. But obviously, as we go through the 70s, there had to be some organizational expertise put in place, that it had to be more than just opening the gate of a field and letting thousands of people in. So I think when the Jazz and Blues Festival found its home in the 70s, with the Reading Festival, it was one of the first kind of genuinely organized, developing festivals with the idea of ensuring that it was going to be a long-term project.
Reading and Glastonbury more or less started at exactly the same time in 1971. Might have been a hippie at Glastonbury, it certainly wasn't a hippie at Reading. You know, you're interested in rock music at Reading, that's where it developed its name. But it had the rawness, the toughness, the absolute dedication to music and music alone, that it still exists.
With Reading in the early part of the 70s, it was a bit tough. You know, the crowds were slightly dangerous. But gradually over the years, promoters began to learn what to do, how to control the crowds, how many rows of loos to put in, you know, the franchises, the whole complexity of festivals then began to dawn on everybody.
I went looking for a site where I could run just a one-day event, a large one, and near a large city, preferably London, which is what I eventually did when I discovered Knebworth.
Freddie arrived in February '74 looking for a site for a Renaissance fair. He'd seen a Renaissance fair in San Francisco, I think, and thought that England needed one. And he saw our bowl-shaped arena and reckoned that actually this was the perfect site to do a rock show. I think my father said absolutely no way. You know, we were worried about the neighbours. Then, of course, Freddie wrote a cheque with a couple of noughts on the end, and then that changed things a bit, and I think we decided to give it a go. And yes, the Knebworth Festival became a fixture of the 70s.
Really, we were particularly ill-suited to a festival format, because so much of what we did involved staging and screens and all the rest of it. And the tendency was, until Glastonbury in particular, there was only one stage and everyone had to get on and off it. And consequently, for us, it just didn't work particularly well. So we went through a brief period of doing festivals and then more or less moved on to simply doing our own outdoor shows. It was great fun because it was an opportunity to do more than we could have done at a regular festival.
Knebworth was massive. I think part of it was the setting. You know, you're out of town, you're in the sort of rolling fields. It's very, very lovely. There's something traditionally English about the whole setting for it. And I don't know, it just became very attractive for the big names, and they all played it in the mid-70s.
Knebworth was the significant festival of the time. It was associated with very big bands, and I thought the wind was with us, that these guys had had their day. And they'd had their day because of that group of bands that I was part of, you know, or the Rats were part of, should I say. And so get rid of all that prog nonsense, you know. The anonymity of the Floyd, which served them well, you know, was anathema to what we were doing. Not that we wanted to be stars, I did, but everyone else pretended they didn't, you know. Knebworth was clearly big for us. It was definitely a leg up. It indicated where we were going.
There was a thing in the 70s where there was a divide between those that were quite happy to go and pay high prices at somewhere like Knebworth and go there in relative comfort and see the really big names, and those that wanted free festivals, and they tended to be people who didn't have much money, and this divide took place.
There was lots of free festivals during the 70s. Every other year, buses would actually turn up, hippie buses, and loads of kids and dogs and all sorts. Slightly untidy, really, through the 70s. I just helped out with water and loos and things. But the 79 we tried again on a proper fee-paying festival. And so I took it all over at that point. Then, in the 80s, we were like a refuge for the nation, really, for all the miners' strikes were going on, Maggie Thatcher and all that stuff. And Stonehenge Festival was being closed down. And so the hippie convoy came here. So 50,000 of them, 50,000 of people that actually paid for their tickets and things. So we had 100,000 people. So the rich were paying for the poor, basically, kind of Robin Hood thing.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
And it did work very well for 10 years. That social mix was very good. And we were all on the same page politically. But the hippie convoy, they're a little bit more angry and slightly dangerous, I would say. But I coped with that for 10 years, and it was an amazing success, really, over that period. That's when the numbers went really high. And so at the end of that period, we're up to 150,000 people. But it all ended in tears, and there was a riot and all that sort of thing, with Molotov cocktails and all the rest of it. So it wasn't really very peaceful in the end.
The 1990 Glastonbury was severely bad. There were riots, basically. There was a pitched battle between the travellers and some festival organisers. There was a fence, but a much smaller fence. And there were people who were like, you pay a tenner to get over the fence and then you get mugged on the other side. There were big gangs of drug dealers, gangs of thieves ripping open tents. That cannot continue, under any circumstances. No, that's not good for anyone. The system had broken down. And I think Somerset Council said to Michael Eavis, this is only going to continue if you sort this out, and he had to build this £1 million fence. So from that moment on, the festival was commercialised. It was no longer the free festival idea, had kind of gone out of the window.
If it becomes a business, then you have to make sure it works effectively as a business. So it has to change things, doesn't it? Because, you're responsible for the safety of 175,000 people. You're also responsible for taking money from people. And if you are putting yourself out there and promising these things, you have to run a good festival. You have a responsibility.
I never believed that a Tory council would actually give me a licence after all that trouble of the 80s, but they did. So we put the fence up. We did away with the free element of the festival. And so everybody paid to come in and the fence worked. And so we are where we are now. But it was getting dangerous because the numbers were getting big as well. So it had to happen, really.
I think you get 110,000 in that field at Glastonbury, the main stage. That's if everybody is there to see you, which a lot of them are not, But when you know that everybody is there to see you and your band, it's a great feeling. Knebworth didn't really strike a chord with me until I actually got there. But leading up to it, then you kind of find out more about it, and it's like, oh wow, they've all played here. It kind of felt that we were in the big league then. And looking back on it now, it's like you were doing that thing that all the great bands did, Led Zeppelin and all that, all very glamorous. It really only compares with Glastonbury for sheer size. So in terms of scale, we did it. We got to the top of the mountain, do you know what I mean? We couldn't have done any more. 1 in 4 people in the entire country applied for tickets. We could have done 7 nights or something. It was mind-boggling.
Here in the U.S. in the 90s, it was an amphitheater-focused business in the States. And we didn't own an amphitheater, so we thought, well, there's a field everywhere. So, why not just find some nice field and put on a show? I just put a plan together to do a show out in the desert, and went to Glastonbury actually in 1997 with a pamphlet to try to talk to bands into playing our festival. So I have this beautiful pamphlet showing the desert with the palm trees and the sun, and it was the rainiest year, Glastonbury 97. And I got laughed out backstage saying, yeah, the pamphlets always look like this, but it's always raining, you know? I'm like, no, it doesn't rain out here. The great things about a festival is like you can go for different types of music. You know, it used to be when someone would say, what music do you like? You would say a specific genre. Just no one answers that way anymore. I think it has to do with the iPod, it has to do with music festivals, you know, all the different streaming services now. But you just go from stage to stage, and 1 minute you're watching world music, the next minute it's a DJ, and it's great. Any festival that's been around for a long time, culture changes during that time. I think creature comforts are a big thing now, you know, at festivals in general. If you were to do the early year festivals as they were, the crowd nowadays couldn't handle it, you know. Glastonbury from 71 is so different than what it is today, you know. And Coachella's been around, you know, coming up 19, 20 years. So if you add, you know, 19 years from Woodstock in 69, you get, you know, Depeche Mode playing the Rose Bowl, which that's changed so much. Keyboards and everyone dressed in black, goth, just a completely different culture than the day that happened at Woodstock. So it would make sense that Coachella, 19 years later, things have changed, and it's going to keep changing. And that's hard for some and beautiful for others.
It was impossible to have seen, you know, the proliferation of festivals that we've seen since the late 90s, 2000. But, you know, for me, the music gets better, the standards get better, the facilities get better, and the diversity gets better. At Latitude, I wanted to create a festival that was more culturally diverse than just a music festival. You know, literature and poetry and theatre and film and dance, as well as still loving great bands. For me, it's that unique live experience that just can't be got anywhere else. And I think people's lives have become incredibly pressured. And people need that release. And they need that release in an environment that is with like-minded people. And festivals do that.
Nothing will ever replace a living experience. It's not like being on, you know, your cell phone or on your computer. It's not like playing, you know, games with people across the world. You're actually, you know, linked together in real life and real time. And I think that it's a great way to interact as a community with like-minded people who enjoy the same things that you do, people who are a similar age and inclination. And I think that those are just great experiences.
The generation that started out growing their hair and experimenting and trying different things out have now grown up, and they're all grandparents at this point. So that means the children of the people that started going to festivals in the first place now want to take their children's children. So it's a natural thing that's happened. And there was a certain kind of person that perhaps wouldn't have dared go to festivals because there was this sort of overriding thought that festivals were just for people to lose themselves in a field for the weekend, you know. Whereas now I think you could get a festival for any kind of person or interest or age group. And quite often festivals appeal to all age groups.
They're very much part of the national season, aren't they? During the establishment. Of course, this is what the establishment does. It colonialises the avant-garde, basically, and brings them into the bourgeoisie. And that's the history of life since the French Revolution. And that's the way you keep people under control nicely, by accepting what they want to do, but modifying it a bit, you know, to make sure it's nicely gentrified and it's an okay thing.
We've got 1 million people now across the world that are pre-registered to come. I mean, we could sell 1 million easily. So it's a huge market now, and so much more fun than it was in the 70s. It really is. It works so well, and people love it to bits. But not my wildest dreams did I ever believe it was going to work like this now.
The whole industry's been turned on its head. The business model was that you made all the money out of records. And you toured often at a loss to promote the record in the hope that people would buy it, and that's where you made your money. Now music's virtually given away free, and what you're hoping is you give it away to enough people, they might develop enough fondness for it to pay huge amounts of money to go and see performers in person. And that's had an effect on the availability of people. No group ever breaks up anymore. Every group gets back together again because this is their main income. And you can blame them. And so everybody's available. And every group that you never thought you'd see again eventually came back and played a festival. There's probably some here playing behind me right now.
I think we have almost reached saturation point in Britain with festivals. Apparently, I was reading somewhere a little while ago, there were 450 music festivals in Britain last summer. But certainly, I think that sense of belonging, being part of something bigger than you, that sense of community is still as valid now as it ever was.
The audiences, to me, make what's happening. The reason we have a successful festival is, of course, the artist, but it's the audience that takes it to another level. They are so happy, man. They are just having a moment of life which takes them away from whatever worries they might have. Yeah, there's no tension, there's no violence in them in a world that is full of violence. And there's a feeling of love and a feeling of unity and togetherness. It's quite a thrill.
If you're in the crowd at a festival, in that crowd you're going to be feeling something really quite extraordinary, particularly children, if you're not a churchgoer, because this is congregation and it's gathering and it's affirmation, but gathering with a common cause, which is to lose oneself. And when you're in a group of people and you lose yourself, even at a great party or a rave or whatever, you find something else in yourself, which is, I think, is of high spiritual quality. And that's something that I saw happening at all of those festivals. And I used to think, nobody's ever going to be able to stop this, because this is something very, very special.